I have a problem. I have a backlog of Lego sets and nowhere to display them, but I wanted to do something more interesting than just sitting them on a plain shelf, so I made my own shelves, custom sized for either 1 or 2 standard base plates. This way I could build directly onto the shelf and not have to worry about things being knocked and moving or falling over. One of the first sets I've chosen is the 2019 Steamboat Willie set, and I've decided a great way to display this would be to build around it a scene similar to what we see in the short film, using entirely grayscale tones. Now the set has a really cool feature, whereby when rolling the ship along, the paddles rotate and the smokestacks move up and down. I really wanted to keep this functionality, but obviously a static shelf display doesn't lend itself too well to something that requires a rolling motion, so I decided to seat the ship on a rolling road system, using wheels driven by a crank and in turn using friction to drive the ship's wheels. Once the spacing was set, this worked perfectly, and now, following the idea of having this dynamic movement of the ship's features, I felt that a more dynamic scene overall was needed to match. Immediately, the Lego Nintendo Entertainment System came to mind, with its moving backdrop operated by a crank arm, so I decided to incorporate this into my build with a new image design, and now the challenge was on to pack both of these features into one smooth function and bring my idea to life. Once I was happy that I could achieve what I wanted with the mechanics of the set, I started thinking about the visuals. I was a little concerned that the tan-coloured plates used in the backdrop might show through when in motion, so I began with replacing them with white plates to ensure there would be no colour leakage. I also increased both the height and width of the backdrop to better cover the area behind the ship. I wanted to include the framed Mickey Mouse silhouette in the build. I'd originally planned to sit this somewhere on the shelf, but I'm a little limited on space, and so had the idea to hang it from the front of the shelf instead. I set to work throwing together a rough framework to help me decide at what height I wanted the terrain and water I planned to surround the boat with, but I noticed that a wall of whichever colour I chose would look a bit bland. In order to break up the monotony of this potential wall of grey, I tried introducing a variety of window frames, arches and modified bricks to bring some texture to the build. But even through switching to Bricklink's studio software to try a greater range of parts and combinations out, I was struggling to find the one I really liked. Following this indecisiveness, I went back to the drawing board in Studio and came up with a design that I did like. Quite simple, yet kind of elegant. I actually liked it even more with a squared fence design, but sadly they don't yet exist in white. So, fence number 1 it is. Let's get building. I decided I wanted to turn the boat around, as I'd realised this gave a better view over the rear, and more crucially, access to the winch of the crane. I also wanted to bring the crank arm which operates the display to the front of the shelf, to make access easier. I began with roughly building a section of the outer wall to see firstly whether it looked any good, and secondly how to integrate the crank arm and drive shaft. I then set about installing the necessary gears and axles, extending them out to drive the newly positioned wheels and accounting for the offset between the main drive shaft and that of the backdrop. I also raised the backdrop up a brick, as otherwise the lowest area of it would be buried below the water surrounding the boat. Speaking of water, I found that unfortunately a 2-stud wide brick wouldn't quite fit between the wall and the boat's paddles, so I could either leave a large gap between them or I could try building sideways. I found that a plate and a tile mounted on the side of a Technic brick were a nice snug fit to the edge of the paddle, but I did have to leave a bit of a hole directly underneath it, otherwise it wouldn't be able to rotate. I felt like progress on this project was really picking up steam. Would I be able to keep up the momentum? After this build session, I went back to the drive system and removed the large beveled gears throughout, opting instead for a small gear driving a large gear on the main drive shaft. I don't really understand the witchcraft behind gear ratios and torque, but this felt a little easier to turn, so I went with it. Last time I'd been looking at building sideways as a way of creating the water around the boat, due to the right side paddle preventing a plate or tile being placed next to it. But after the session I'd had a thought. The driving wheels were fixed on axles and could therefore be positioned anywhere along their length, allowing me to move the boat just far over enough to fit that tile in. I had to shift the bricks supporting the axles out one stud on either side of the wheels to allow for them to be repositioned, then used bushes to prevent any lateral movement and keep the boat from sliding side to side. The new wheel position gave me all the space I needed for tiling and doing away with a more complicated system. Before I began laying plates and tiles down, I wanted to finish building the bordering wall, but doing so required changing the backdrop's foundations. It was an easy enough process, swapping out 2x8 bricks for 2x6s, and I did away with the large Technic bricks to save them for something else. Unfortunately, I wasn't quite sure how to manage the wheels acting as runners for the backdrop, as I wasn't sure whether the decorative fences would hold them in place securely, so I left the issue for later. Now that I'd moved the boat, I had to choose whether I wanted the river's embankment to be 2 studs wide or 3. I felt that 2 studs wide looked a little awkward, especially with the plantation I'd planned to use, but I didn't really want the paddles having no water between them and the embankment. I decided on 3 studs, and finally began laying down the tiles. Now, while laying tiles may be simpler than building sideways, doing so does mean not being able to follow the rounded edge of the boat's hull as well, and leaving some jagged edges, but I was willing to accept this limitation as a trade-off for the simplicity. With the tiles in place, I laid out a rough mock-up of the embankment to test how the width and colours would work. I liked the choices I'd made, and wrapped up the session here. It's time to get decorating. First, I tackled the area up front, aiming to create a natural looking embankment for the river. I used bricks and plates to create a varied terrain onto which I arranged a small selection of plants, keeping with the black and white theme of course. The backdrop presented me with quite a challenge, creating a smooth flowing image which needed to move and separate with the plates. Due to the movement, I was unable to use plates or tiles wider than 2 studs, which unfortunately left me unable to create more complex slopes and curves for a natural looking rolling hillside. I tried a couple of different techniques using curved and wedge-shaped plates and tiles, but these each presented me with their own problems, as I was also limited on the depth of the image. I decided to muddle on and do the best I could with simple squared plates and tiles, hoping that the movement of the image and a focus on the steamboat might help create an illusion of a smoother landscape. Due to how close the boat's paddle was to the backdrop, I was limited on how deep the image could be. I thought I might be able to combat this by moving the paddle in closer, but unfortunately realised they don't make axles of the required length. So I was confined to making the trees the same depth as the hillside. I did the best I could, and felt that the shapes and colour contrasts helped them to stand out adequately from the rest of the background. But could I maybe find a better solution? After the last session, I had the idea to thin the background down by removing the backing plates, allowing me to bring the trees out in front of the hills, helping them to pop more in the scene. It made the build a little flimsy feeling, but it seemed to hold up okay when running, so I went with it. Until now, I hadn't really had a solid idea for a frame to surround the background, so as I did with the foundations, I used software to design it. It may look quite simple from the outside, but it was actually deceptively challenging to create. The outer walls had to give enough room for the background to rotate freely without parts knocking or snagging, but I didn't want some bloated box hanging over the edges of the shelf, nor did I want to narrow down the screen. The solution was to create panels from large tiles and use minimal brickwork in the corners to support them. The front surround could be built with bricks, but I felt that plain bricks alone wouldn't be too attractive. I had a vision in my head of tiles tucked in behind the bricks, just peeking out a stud or 2. Now 1 stud width is 2.5 plates depth. I know that the front face of a bracket is half a plate thick, so adding a plate plus a tile to that will seat the tile flush against a brick. Using this knowledge, I was able to add in a narrow panel, which just peeked out from behind a brick as I wanted. Creating the lid was even more of a challenge. I needed to extend the framework of the carousel upwards to support it, but to do that I needed to calculate both the height of the Technic framework and system framework and match them up appropriately. This caused me a huge headache. I was so certain that I'd correctly calculated both, yet something wasn't quite adding up. Following last time's frustration, I re-examined the carousel's framework and found that a very small height difference between the left and right side of the foundations was at fault. Using software rather than going by eye gave me an accurate representation of exactly how things would align, so I took advantage to create the full complex interior framework needed to square up the exterior frame. Before I got started on the physical build, I decided I wanted to add in some more foliage to liven up that backdrop. I created several small bushes of varying sizes, which just helped to break up that monotone hillside. Thanks to a delivery of new parts, I was able to build up the front corners of the frame entirely in black, before setting about adding in the new interior framework design. This allowed me to finish off the front face of the build. For the rear of the build, rather than simply cover it all in black, I opted instead to use clear panels. These wouldn't technically be visible while the shelf was mounted on a wall, but the shelves are designed to be easily removed from their brackets for viewing, so I thought clear was a bit more interesting. Unfortunately, I hadn't ordered enough panels for this stream though, so I had to leave a few gaps for now. The final touch was adding the modified bricks, a few fiddly Technic parts, and topping off with some more tiles to create the lid. I was also one tile short. Will I ever get this build finished?